So we're here at Llyn-y-Dywarchen, the lake behind me, here in North Wales, about 5 miles north of Beddgelert, which is down the valley in that direction. Now Llyn-y-Dywarchen, I'm told, means Lake of the Turf, Lake of the Turf. The reason being that once upon a time there used to be an island of turf that would float around in this lake, move around, and for that reason people knew that it couldn't be an island of this world, it had to be something magical. And there's a story about how that island came to be here. Unfortunately it's not there now. Apparently it was there 200 years ago, about 200 years ago according to the book that I learnt this story from. And I read in a guidebook in Porthmadog earlier this week that it was there back in, I think it was the 12th century or something, when Gerald of Wales, a monk, made his famous tour around Wales describing lots of places as he went. And so for that reason this story could well be very, very old. If it happened, it must have happened long before that time. The story goes that once upon a time there was a shepherd. There was a shepherd from a farm just a short way that way. And he used to graze his flocks all on the hills around this lake. But one day, 2 of the lambs had got away and they were running, and he had to chase after them. And then when he came here to the lake, then he saw, standing on the shore, dripping wet, the most beautiful, graceful woman, such unearthly serenity about her that he ever seen. And she looked straight at him with the most wise, knowing eyes. She held out her arms to him. She told him that she had been watching him from her home beneath the water for a long time, and she was in love with him, and she'd been desperate for a chance to meet him. So obviously he was very, very, very overcome by all this, and so he stopped what he was doing straight away and he stopped to talk with her, and they sat together at the shore of the lake. And it didn't take long before he felt that he too was falling deeply in love with her. And when the time came to part, then he begged her to come home with him, marry him so they could live together on the farm. But she said no, she couldn't. She had to return to her home beneath the waters. Well, he knew that she must be one of the fairy folk. It's here in Wales, that's one of the many ways that they can return to their world, is through the surface of certain lakes. And so he went home sadly. But they met again the next day, and then again the day after that, and lots of times they would meet here on the shore, and he'd kind of let the sheep look after themselves while he just soaked up the company of the woman that he loved. And in the end, after he'd begged her to marry him so many times, she agreed. She said she would ask her father if she could marry him. But she said before it could happen, they would have to both meet her father and both ask permission together. And so she asked the shepherd to come back to the lake that very night and to wait in the dark in the edge of the trees. And as you can see, there aren't that many trees here now, but the story says that there would have been trees standing on the hill slopes around here at that time, and he had to wait there just in the edge of the trees until the moon had set behind the mountain called Agarn, which is this one here. And so he waited, and he waited long and lonely. It was cold and wet and damp, like only a night in Wales can be. And he was just about starting to give up hope when suddenly he noticed, just as the moon set and the shadow of Agarn fell across the water, there was his love standing near him in the shadow of the trees, and behind her was another shape, a dark, shrouded shape. He could never quite make it out, and afterwards he could never quite clearly remember what he'd seen. But there was a deep, strong voice that came from that shape, and it said, you are the mortal man who would have my daughter as his wife. And he was very afraid, but he plucked up his courage and he said, yes, I would, if it so please you. And the fairy woman's father said, well, I've been watching you today, and I think I would agree. And I've even brought here a sack of gold to set you both up comfortably in life, but there's one condition. My daughter must never, ever touch iron. Iron. One of the many things that the fairy folk are supposed to be so afraid of, to hate with a passion. Things you can ward them off with, iron or salt, these things that are markers of what we like to think of as our control over the world, by which we can pretend that maybe we're not quite so at the mercy of theirs. And the fairy lord said that if ever his daughter should come into contact with iron, then she would have to leave her husband. She'd have to return to her home under the lake, and she could never again meet him on the soil of this earth. But the fairy and her husband-to-be were both so excited that he'd agreed that they were both sure they could manage that somehow. And so they got married. They went home that very night, back to his house at the farm, and they were happy. And they lived long and happily together, and they had lots of children, and that bag of fairy gold meant they were always comfortable. But one day, as they were riding back up the valley from Bev Gelert, and they went round the edge of Llyn Gadair, which is another lake just further down the valley where it gets very marshy and boggy, then her horse slipped in the mud and it twisted its foot, and it couldn't carry her weight anymore. So her husband, being the kind man he was, said, well, you can climb up behind me on my horse. But the thing was, her horse, its bridle and its saddle, they'd always made sure it was specially made with brass fittings, but his had all the normal bits. And as she climbed up behind him, her ankle brushed against some iron on his stirrup. At first nothing happened. He could feel her arms around his waist and the weight of her behind him in the saddle. But as they kept walking up the valley, riding up the valley, they saw figures starting to appear out of the landscape. Graceful figures dressed in green, emerging from among the rocks and the stubby grass. And suddenly, the shepherd realised that there was no weight behind him on the saddle, no arms around his waist. And as he looked and turned and then looked back, his wife and all the figures had gone. The fairies had come to call her back to her world. And he was sad then, and he had to go home and explain to their children, and they were all heartbroken. And then long, long days he spent just grazing his sheep on the sides of the hills, longing for his beloved. But it doesn't end there, because one day when he was doing just that, sitting watching over his flock, in a world that no longer seemed so full of joy for him, he saw, rising out of the water, an island that broke the surface and floated towards him. And standing there in the centre of that island was none other than his wife, the woman he loved more than anything in the world, with her arms held out to him just like that first day that they met. And he was overjoyed, and he threw down his crook and he ran to meet her. And as the island reached the shore, they held each other so tight. And she told him that she'd been pleading with her mother to find some way of breaking her father's ban. And they had together devised this plan where if they could bring an island of fairy earth up to the lake, then she could meet him without setting foot on the soil of this earth. And so from that day onwards, every single day, then she would come to meet him on that island, and their children too, and they would enjoy hours and hours and days in each other's company here under the sun. And so, despite all the challenges and despite the fairy magic, they did live happily ever after.